You're listening to the Ecocide Report, a monthly podcast from Stop Ecocide International and the Movement for Ecocide Law. Stop Ecocide International is working tirelessly to get ecocide recognised by the International Criminal Court, but we need your help. If you value this content or want to support the work of Stop Ecocide International, you can become a patron over at patreon.com for just 1 hour's wage per month. Your support makes our work possible, and we can't thank you enough.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Ecocide Report from Stop Ecocide International. It's been a few months since we did our fourth report, so welcome to our fifth. I'm here with my good friend Jojo, Merthyr, and today we come to you from the Royal Society of Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce here on John Adams Street in London. With these grand surroundings, we bring you news of really quite grand happenings. Do you want to talk us through this?
Thanks, Chidi. So there is so much to talk about since we last met. In fact, so much so that for the first time, we've actually got a list of notes here so that we can make sure that we don't miss anything out. I think maybe we could dive in starting with what's been happening in the European Union. Does that work for you?
The EU Crime Directive.
Absolutely. So as has been mentioned on our previous episodes, the European Union is currently revising its directive on the protection of the environment through criminal law. And all the different consultative committees of the Parliament have already expressed support for including ecocide or ecocide level crimes into that directive. And the key committee to do that was the Legal Affairs Committee, as you can imagine. And that happened in March. And the text that committee put forward to the Parliament effectively called for the inclusion of the most grave offences against the environment using the language very much of the international definition that was commissioned by our foundation a couple of years ago. So severe and either widespread or long-term irreversible damage. So that was fantastic. And very quickly, literally within 10 days, the European Parliament had approved that text to go forward to the final stages of discussion around that directive. So that's incredibly exciting and a really big win. And what we're looking at now is what are called trilogues. So it's a discussion between the European Parliament, the European Commission, which provided the original revised draft, and also the Council of Ministers. And some of those discussions have already happened, some of them are still to come. The next that we know of is coming up in mid-June. And so what we're obviously hoping is that framework that has been proposed by the Legal Affairs Committee will actually carry through to how the directive finishes up.
That's amazing. So in terms of timescales, this is only a 3-month sort of interregnum between that trilogue consultation and your potential results in June. What sort of timescale are you thinking of for the directive itself?
Well, we've been told that that discussions could be concluded before the summer, but certainly this year. So could be looking at September perhaps. So we will know within the next few months, in what form those serious, most grave crimes are going to be included within that directive. But it's been such an extraordinary trajectory to think that in 2019 there were no governments talking about this. And in 2023 we have the European Parliament proposing to include this level of crime into EU law. So that's a phenomenal distance to have travelled.
It absolutely is. There's a theme running through some work that's going on here at the RSA during the Fellows Festival on the 17th of June. People are going to be asking the question, what could go right? And this is absolutely one of those things that's going right. Well done.
Thank you, and that's fantastic that that's going to come up. And I think what's also really important here is that there has been strong civil society input all the way through from position paper from our own foundation, but many other NGOs, and also petitions across Europe with tens of thousands of signatories, saying that ecocide is something that the EU should be addressing, effectively potentially en route to it becoming an international crime at the ICC. And that civil society input is really important. important. And I think what people often don't realise is that some of the biggest global conferences actually specifically invite consultations with civil society that then get taken into those discussions at kind of state level. And that's something we've also been seeing more of in the last few months. So, for example, the G7 met just last week, and part of the input to those meetings came from the C7, which is the civil society input consultation. And our legal analyst, Anna Madrick, was very much in the thick of those discussions. And certainly when we look at the documents that went through to the G7, we can see that a call for criminalising ecocide was part of that document, and not just that one. So we've been looking at, for example, the input to the Global Futures Forum, effectively the preparatory stages for the Summit of the Future, which is a summit that's going to be held in 2024 in September, that's been called by Antonio Guterres. And that process also has produced a civil society document that's just emerged called the People's Pact. And once again, they're calling for, in the sort of category of environmental governance, they are calling for a crime of ecocide at the international level. So I think what we're seeing here is a real,
gathering of pace.
Yes, a gathering of pace, a direction of travel. This is something that is kind of starting to pop up everywhere.
That's absolutely wonderful. So I'm really glad you mentioned the G7 actually, and the C7 that goes along with it, because only 4 or 5 days ago, and it hasn't really made the headline press in the way that it should do in my opinion, the US and China signed a G20 communique, a joint venture communique, where they intend to fund large-scale infrastructure on green finance bases together. So we're sort of seeing impact come together at high level. Now, unfortunately, unlike the C7 that goes to the G7, there isn't a C20 yet.
But there will be. And in fact, there is actually, we've already been invited to take part in aspects of that C20 input. So I'm glad to say that there will be some input coming in from civil society. And it's extremely likely also to include Ecocide Law as part of those demands. So that's very exciting. And that's going to be taking place in India in September, as we understand it. So, and that's very exciting that the US and China are actually talking about working together in this context. And I think one of the things that we also need to look at, and I think is very important for the Ecocide Law initiative, is what we need to also be watching is when we're transitioning from a fossil fuel-based economy to one that is based on renewables, to effectively we're looking at sort of global move towards electrification, all of these things. What we need to be careful of and aware of is that we don't sort of sleepwalk from a frying pan into a fire in terms of sourcing the minerals that are needed for that transition. 100%. Because actually there is a strong correlation between the most fragile and the most important ecosystems in the world and also the places where those minerals 100%. Are found. And so, it's not just about addressing carbon, it's not just about addressing emissions. It's very important that we actually look at protection for all ecosystems 100%. So that major damage is prohibited before we get to the stage where we end up repeating our mistakes.
Well, again, very prescient comments. So one of the other things that came out of the G7 was, and this is really unexpected, was that in Hiroshima, where it happened, the Japanese contingencies decided to press forward with a declaration that there should not be any more nuclear weapons on the planet. Now, obviously, we've been through denuclearization in the 80s and 90s, and now we sit at the precipice, because of all the wars that are currently breaking out, of listening to global leaders talk about nuclear weapons as though it's a conventional reality all over again. And as you say, the construct of war includes ecocide as well as mass destruction with things like nuclear weapons. So within that context, actually, could you talk in a bit more detail about United for Justice, the conference you attended at Lviv?
Absolutely. So this brings the whole sort of discussion to the subject of environmental damage within conflict, within armed conflict. As you say, I attended a conference in Ukraine actually at the beginning of March that was called United for Justice and brought together an incredible array of foreign ministers, general attorneys, heads of state even, and talking about, actually the key part of the conversation was around potential tribunal for a crime of aggression. And the technicalities of that, and looking at the various damages and potential war crimes that have been carried out in Ukraine. But there was a dedicated panel, and this was why I was there with a legal associate who spoke on that panel. There was a dedicated panel on the environmental damage that has been suffered during the aggression. So, and it's been quite extraordinary levels of damage in terms of land that's been covered in mines, waters and soils that have been chemically polluted, and obviously potential radioactive contamination, different kinds of environmental pollution, and this ties in very closely with what happened in January at the Council of Europe, which has 46 member states, and which put through a resolution and a recommendation around environmental damage in armed conflict, which again recommended heavily to its member states to legislate for ecocide and to support it at the international level. And this conference again was highlighting the importance of paying attention to this, because of course it's extremely understandable that during war the human cost and the cost to homes and to infrastructure and the real kind of immediacy of that can take, and quite possibly rightly so, can take precedence. However, we ignore the environmental damage at our peril, because of course environmental damage from conflict can last well beyond the end of that conflict, and well beyond the rebuilding even of countries suffering conflict. And I think it's very interesting and it's encouraging that Ukraine has been very vocal on ecocide and on environmental damage, because it shows a kind of a stepping up beyond just being an immediate victim, which they clearly are, but at the same time wanting something to be put in place. In other words, to say, look, nobody else should have to suffer what we've suffered. I mean, clearly, if you put a crime of ecocide in place now, it's not going to apply to damage that's already happened. So there's a kind of investment in the future and in the wider picture here that is coming from Ukraine.
I really like these ideas, and forgive me for interrupting, but I think it's really important to amplify the fact that the causal links between conventional war damage and ecocide are very clear. Enemy combatants will commit ecocide specifically to inflict damage during a war. So it's not there's any doubt about the fact that ecocide is committed because there's a war on. But what is crucial, which you're pointing out, which should be amplified, is that we outlaw chemical weapons, which do short-term ecocide damage. But there's a whole slew, there's a whole tail of other things that get done, which have much longer-term impacts. Land mining, water poisoning, land poisoning, destruction, burning of vegetation on a gigantic scale. All of these things are potentially just as damaging, maybe even more so than short-term chemical attacks. But there seems to be a gap in the law, and this is where the law that stops ecocide steps in.
Very much so, and I think we're finding this in many different areas as well. I think it's something that this sense, if you like, that criminalising ecocide, in other words, naming the worst harms as crimes, has a kind of almost a kind of container effect, because there are obviously specific laws in place for different things, and this is a bit of a jump, but we've just been having quite a few discussions around finance actually, and around the frameworks that are coming in for reporting on, climate-related financial disclosures, nature-related financial disclosures, cross-border adjustment mechanisms, all of these things, and looking at, sort of regulation around, deforestation, and all of these things are really, really important, but they don't kind of have, they don't cover everything. And that's not to say that ecocide law is a silver bullet that will cover everything, but what it will do is it provides that kind of foundational piece that shores up all of that regulation, and means that, where those gaps are, where severe harm is happening, it comes in and it creates that additional level of accountability, that additional level, and of course, going back to the conflict context, that additional sort of thing of, okay, so now we're also committing this level of crime. So, there's something about having that outer boundary, having that container, foundational piece that that helps with the rest of regulation, but it also does this kind of cultural shift in the mind, because what it does, and this is so interesting, because what we often get asked things about, how will this affect, the sort of risk aspects that we're looking at in, insurance or investment or all of these things, and it's like, where does this sit? And when you say, well, this is a criminal law, so it kind of sits where like murder sits, and people kind of go, oh gosh, okay, this is a completely different approach. It's a completely different way of, it's different to try and work your way around very specific regulation. And it's another to deal with a genuine hazard and to deal with it in a cautious way, in the same way as you would treat, let's say, a health and safety law, but of a criminal variety. I mean, you don't try to, design an environment that is almost going to badly damage people. You just try and design an environment that isn't going to damage people.
Lines, yeah.
So it's adding that kind of outer framework that seems to be, it's often quite a strong shift for people to make within their minds, even though the putting it in place is in a way quite simple. You're simply saying, okay, this is another offence on a list of offences.
Well, I think you can say that about any law, because all law is about clarifying rules, setting out red lines, explaining punishments in detail, so that they do feed into a risk management matrix. But there's a bigger point, and the bigger point you're making is that it's a cultural event. We know there are red lines around sort of chemical warfare. We know there are red lines around nuclear warfare. We should know that there are red lines around mass ecocide, because the knock-on effects to the living world affect all of us. And as we said earlier on, in a longer term, over a longer framework, you can actually make the argument that the net present value of a mass ecocide event is greater or more negative, if you like, than a sudden specific act that we can see and punish and chastise in one way. But we fail to understand the gravity of these long-term impacts that go along with ecocide. Exploring that in a bit more detail, in Hiroshima, the reviews about stopping nuclear weapons being used did not explicitly rule out ecocide as a side effect of nuclear weapons. But of course, we know that they are. So one of the things that I like about Stop Ecocide International and the campaign is not just that it provides a framework for risk management, it's actually also a point of escalation. So if you've done something that is really very bad and destroyed a city in the horrific and globally, historically defining episodes that were Hiroshima and Nagasaki, imagine now if someone else were mad enough to try and do that. They could potentially be charged with a whole range of crimes, including also ecocide.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting to think about that in the context of nuclear, because while potentially the fabrication, even the possession of a nuclear weapon one could argue is not ecocidal, and the same with having a nuclear power plant or what have you, the use of a nuclear weapon or an accident in a nuclear power plant, almost without doubt, will be ecocidal. And so there's an interesting sort of dynamic there, and one that potentially needs to be in place. And in terms of the civil use of nuclear, it will make things like safety protocols, tenfold more important. And of course, there's plenty of other arguments against the use of nuclear for generating power, but just from that perspective. But certainly in the military context, it would be impossible to actually use a nuclear weapon. 100%. And actually, that should be the case. So that's actually a very important aspect.
You could amplify the practicalities of these rules even more, I think, with the upcoming consultation by the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD. So in October of this year, we're supposed to be getting some clarification from the first release from the TNFD about the scopes of disclosure that companies are supposed to make regarding the impact of their work as a going concern on nature. So in this particular example, you can imagine that if a particular generator of electricity decided that nuclear electricity was the optimal business they wanted to be in, you could imagine that Ecocide Law would also sit within these scopes. So the safety hazards they have, the safety measures they implement, the tolerances they have for managing risk, all of those would be disclosed in this broader context of their potential impact on nature and the world around them. Again, a great act, I think, of clarification.
Very important, very important.
But before we move on to our next issue to discuss, is there anything else you'd like to talk about regarding your visits to Ukraine?
I actually wanted to talk about perhaps a follow-up that came out of that, which is to do with the Council of Europe, which, as we know, Ukraine has been, had been very much driving the resolutions there around ecocide. The Council of Europe had its 4th summit, and that's actually not very many summits, given it's 70 years old, right? So only its 4th Heads of State summit in Reykjavik this month, and we held an event alongside that where one of Zelensky's colleagues, an MP from Ukraine, gave a fantastic and impassioned speech around the importance of ecocide in the context of armed conflict. And we've also had a lot of interest from the Icelandic government as well. So the Icelandic Prime Minister herself has spoken about the importance of moving the ecocide discussion forward. And of course, she was hosting this summit. And while perhaps the world's heads of state are not collectively quite ready to pronounce on ecocide, what they did do in that summit was concentrate very strongly on the environmental damage suffered by Ukraine in the war, and looking at actually cataloguing that at creating a kind of reporting context for that framework. Thank you for that. And also, of course, supporting Zelensky's peace formula, which actually does name the environmental damage as ecocide. So there's, there is again a kind of broadening of that conversation at the highest level that has kind of arisen out of those discussions with Ukraine and with Council of Europe. So that's been very exciting too.
That's formidable, and I want to amplify the fact that this is Council of Europe, not European Council, not European Commission, not European Union, Council of Europe, which of course is much bigger and much more established in lots of ways.
That's right. I mean, the Council of Europe is, not to be confused with the European Union, is a group of 46 countries, and it's effectively, it's the body that's behind the European Court of Human Rights. And it's sometimes considered as a kind of legislative laboratory, if you like. So, it's got a larger number of states that are members, and, it involves a lot of potential beginnings of, it's kind of where new conventions are fermented. In fact, while we're on that subject, they are actually discussing a new convention on protection of the environment through criminal law. So the Council of Europe is also working on that. And undoubtedly, the issue of ecocide will be in there, given the resolution recommendations coming out of the Parliamentary Assembly of that council. So, again, very much a broadening of that conversation.
That's formidable. Well done. So the next issue, which is by no means a small issue, was the documentary on the Amazonian movement in Brazil. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yes, indeed. So I recently spent 9 days in Brazil, mostly in the capital, Brasilia, at the end of April, because I was there with Princess Esmeralda of Belgium and with Gert Peter Bruch, a film director and also the founder of NGO Planet Amazon. These two have been working together to co-direct and produce a documentary, which is an advocacy piece. It's around the demarcation of indigenous territories in the Amazon, which has been shown to be one of the surest ways to protect the Amazonian rainforest, and also about ecocide law and how those two things can work together to protect the Amazon as one of the world's key vital ecosystems. So we were in Brasilia for a special screening of that documentary. It's not completely completed yet, but and that was at the Belgian embassy, and that was phenomenal. And most importantly, was the timing, because every year in Brasilia, the indigenous groups from around Brazil all come together in the capital in a sort of camp, and it's almost like a festival. And of course, in recent years, as one can imagine, through the Bolsonaro years and of course stretching before as well, this was a resistance camp. This was a protest camp. And, marches were made on the Congress building, by the indigenous leaders from all around the country. Now, this year was different because this year, as Lula has once more become president and he has instigated some really major changes, and one of those is there is now in Brazil a ministry for indigenous peoples, and that the minister for that ministry is Sonia Guajajara, a very famous kind of eco-warrior, really, in the context of protection of the Amazon, and very respected and well-known earth defender. And that ministry is completely staffed, obviously, with indigenous officials. And that effectively means that for the first time in the history of Brazil, the indigenous voice is part of government. So this year, that camp was more than just a coming together and raising of issues, which it still was, but it was also a celebration. And for the first time, that march from the camp to the Congress actually ended in the welcoming in to the Congress chamber of the indigenous leaders. And that was an extraordinary thing to witness. And what was also launched while we were there was an interparliamentary alliance for the defense of indigenous peoples. And President Lula came to the camp himself and both signed additional demarcations of indigenous territories, but also explained there was going to be a government-wide mandate to consider the well-being of the indigenous people and territories within government decision making. So there are major changes happening in Brazil. And so it was a very, very kind of potent and poignant moment to be there and to be showing this film. And what was also really striking was that what we realized is that actually, even in Brazil itself, raising awareness around what the indigenous cultural practices can provide for the preservation of the ecosystems, the value of that, the intrinsic value of indigenous culture, and really relating to how these leaders speak about their relationship with nature, and all of that is something that actually isn't familiar in Brazilian society either, and so this felt like a very powerful thing to be bringing, and that was really an amazing,
incredibly apposite observation. I think that we in the West think that there is this idyll, there's this amazing place somewhere far away where indigenous cultures haven't had the post-colonial impacts of effectively cultural genocides, and that there is a pristine indigenous Xanadu somewhere where everything is happening entirely by itself, where it's healing itself, regenerating itself automatically. But that's just not true. The truth is that we all need to pull together, because even in the places where the wisdom still resides in small patches, networking that, actualizing that, having leaders like Lula step in, demarcate indigenous territories, and try to show best practice for what earth defenders can do, what indigenous cultures can do, is formidable. I say this because I know that the Australians are in the middle of having a conversation, a national conversation, and potentially even a referendum on trying to institute some kind of indigenous knowledge at federal government level. But what we need is this same kind of leadership. We need demarcation of territories where best practice can be shown and implemented unimpeded. If we did that in Amazonia, we did it in Western Australia, and we did it across the Congo Basin and surrounding areas, we'd be restoring the lungs of the world. We'd be saving the free good, the public free good that is oxygen, clean air for everyone to breathe. And it's incredible that developments like the ones you've talked about are so crucial in this period of our climate ecological emergency. They are literally about about life itself.
Absolutely, and I think that there is also this aspect to the contribution of forests that is often perhaps overlooked. Again, if we get obsessed with carbon, we may forget about what actually happens in terms of the transpiration, in terms of what the provision and the support of the water systems globally, you know, that absolutely depend, and that's in the Amazon, as you say, in the Congo, but also in the boreal forests. You know, this is all incredibly important, and again, becomes incredibly relevant to have Ecocide Law in place. Effectively, you're both, you know, protecting and you know, protecting those territories and deterring the worst harms, but in the context where Indigenous defenders are protecting and standing up to protect those territories, what we have at the moment is often a kind of narrative where those earth defenders are criminals getting in the way of legitimate business activity. Exactly.
Yes.
And so once you put a law like this in place, what you're doing, you know, regardless of any prosecutions that may or may not be taken, what you're doing is you're moving the question mark from away from above the heads of those defenders to over the business activity itself. And when you do that, you are reframing things completely. You're literally flipping it 180 degrees. You're flipping that norm. And that is super, super important. And that is something also that we found that Indigenous spokespeople relate to very strongly about what we're doing, as well as, of course, the very kind of basic understanding that, you know, when we damage Mother Earth, there are consequences. There are consequences, and why should the global legal system not reflect that? It's intuitive. So that's been, I think that was very much kind of highlighted and discussed, you know, while we were out there. And it's also interesting that, you know, there has been, you know, a bill on ecocide, you know, prepared for potentially the Brazilian context. You know, obviously how that moves forward, you know, and how the movement moves forward now in Brazil will be fantastic to watch, but I think it was very galvanizing, some of the meetings and gatherings that we had out there.
That's amazing. Again, I can't say it loud enough. The idea of having global best practice amplified in this way just sets this amazing trail for others to follow. Yeah, no words. Really very well done. Well done. Right, so moving on, our next issue was about the launch of the Ocean Ecocide Law Network. What's going on there?
So we are beginning to sort of develop a whole kind of range of special interest networks who are interested in this legislation, because we have you know, a situation where, as I said, on one level it's very simple, it's adding a crime to a list of crimes, but actually when you look at the impacts and the ramifications of putting this law in place, we realize how many different areas this impacts in positive ways. And so there have been various networks sort of gradually growing up, I mean, from the very obvious kind of you know, lawyers, but also you know, youth networks, faith networks, and the latest is actually an Ocean for Ecocide Law network, because I think we're particularly looking at the interest in the fact that ocean is paid not nearly enough attention to in the context of, I mean, if we look at, for example, the range of Sustainable Development Goals, I mean, there are 17 of them, and the ocean one, I believe, is the least it's had the least activity dedicated to it hitherto. And, you know, effectively, you know, the ocean is the big climate regulator. You know, there are billions of people that depend in some way or other upon the ocean, whether that's for their livelihoods, millions, multiple millions for their livelihoods, but, you know, many, many more in terms of sustenance and so on. So it's really, really important that oceans are protected. And there are various legal approaches being taken around that, and there are some, you know, issues arising with sort of different new forms of extraction that for example, deep seabed mining, which are controversial and rightly so, and should be examined very carefully before they're delved into. And I think Ecocide Law will set parameters around, you know, those potential activities. But also, you know, there are looking at areas beyond national jurisdiction, and I think the fact that what we're aiming for with Ecocide Law is an international level crime is very important, because when you're looking at activity in coastal waters, but also in the high seas, you know, you're looking at sometimes areas that can't be reached by 100%. Some forms of law. 100%. But of course, if you're a ship in the high seas, you are still registered in a jurisdiction, and so an international law can still reach you. And so that's also very important.
You said a number of things there that should be amplified, but one of the things that caught me almost immediately was that, especially in the case of the high seas, this idea that some distance away from the coast, you fall outside of national jurisdictions, and the open ocean, the open sea, as it were, is the classic commons, not covered or owned by any one nation, shared by all, and still, overused, abused, and yet not properly accounted for, regulated, protected, or looked after. And so, yes, the ocean ecocide law sounds like a very logical place to put in effort. In terms of country partners, institutional support, where are you in that process?
So we're working closely with partners such as Gallifrey Foundation and Mission Blue and many others actually who are all wanting to come on board with this Oceans Network, which is really, really encouraging. And we had an event during the UN Water Conference. We also had an online event during the Panama Ocean Conference as kind of precursors to the key launch. We're launching with a wonderful event in New York. It is our kind of official network launch. On the 7th of June, because the World Oceans Day is actually the following day on the 8th of June, and that's with the remarkable Sylvia Earle, who is pretty much a living legend in the context of ocean conservation, and we're having a kind of fireside chat in person. If you're in New York, it's a first come, first served on those tickets, so run for those, but it will be live streamed as well, so that's exciting, and that's coming up.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Well done. Also, before we wind up, we've covered quite a lot today, but I'm really keen to find out more about the work you've been doing with the islands of the Pacific. Could you talk more about that?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because there's been some extraordinary developments with that as well. The Republic of Vanuatu, which is one of the Pacific Ocean states that we've been working with closely for some years already, had the most extraordinary victory at the UN in March. Literally, it was the same day that the EU proposed through that text that we were talking about earlier. On that same day in New York, a request was made for the International Court of Justice, which is the UN court, sometimes known as the World Court, to give an advisory opinion on what the obligations are of nation states, of governments, to their citizens in relation to climate change. And this is a request, and it's the first time a request of that type has ever gone through at the UN without a vote. It was a consensus request. And that was the work of Vanuatu. And they have this extraordinary talent for diplomatic advocacy, and they actually had 132 countries request it with them, which is why a vote wasn't needed. And that's incredible. And what Vanuatu is doing is really quite extraordinary. They're such a small country in terms of population, and they are very much threatened, in a life and death situation already with regard to the impacts of climate change. And the way that they have been approaching this is just extraordinary. They are not playing victim. They are absolutely saying, what can we do? What can we offer? What can we drive that will actually help the entire global community, not just us? And what they're really championing are legal avenues. And that was one of them. And it was an extraordinary victory. And what Vanuatu is now wanting to do is to put that diplomatic strategy, that advocacy ability that punches so much above their weight, behind other legal avenues, such as Ecocide Law. They're also working with those working on a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. They're working on advisory opinion with the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea. But they've been long-term partners of the initiative to criminalise ecocide, and they were, of course, the first to flag that up at the ICC as a state. So I think I just want to acknowledge the extraordinary work they've been doing, and to say that we're very much looking forward to, to really working with them, more closely over the coming years in terms of, really bringing the ICC initiative to its next stage.
That's formidable. I mean, it's difficult to overstate how amazingly uplifting it is when small nation states who are on the brink, in the middle of a global climate change emergency, fight so hard and get so much support simultaneously. That show of solidarity, that impact, that progress, all of it is frankly joyous to hear. Within that context, I want to talk about calls to action. So I think this is the perfect time, while we all think about what parts we can play, what energy we can bring, how we can make a difference. This is the perfect time for you to talk in a bit more detail about specific calls to action, things that your partners or people who are watching now can do to help move things even further forward.
I'd love to do that, and I really want to acknowledge as well that that this is. This is a movement now, a global movement, and that effectively we have associate groups and teams in over 45 countries now, and they're all doing phenomenal things in different ways, and of course they're different flavors in different places depending on the skills that people are bringing to it. I mean, just one example, there was a demonstration in Brussels just last week calling for EU and international and also local Belgian developments towards Ecocide Law and criminalising the worst harms to nature, and that was a collaborative effort also with other local organisations like Greenpeace, like Rise for Climate and so on. So there's a real kind of collaborative feel to how this is moving forward. Is very much a kind of many hands make light work, so to speak, in that way. And in terms of some specifics, that film I talked about, the Amazonia, it's called Amazonia, Heart of Mother Earth, and that is going to be having a screening during London Climate Week in the Marylebone Theatre on the 26th of June. So, that's something that people can actually potentially attend. Then there are also, things that for example, there's the live stream I mentioned in New York of the Explorers Club event with Sylvia Earle. There are also, we would also really recommend people to keep up with the breaking news section on our website, because it's almost like a kind of a journal of all of these developments. And so, things like, the input to the different conferences, all of these kinds of things can be checked out there. And there are, of course, also, that we have an Act Now menu that is as long as my arm. So do visit the website and check that out. But again, with specifics, for example, with the EU, there are petitions that can be signed, and we can also, if you go to our events pages, you can re-watch, some of the webinars that have been put out. So there are many different sort of ways, if you like, that you can get involved, and again with a network. So I was talking about, it's the Ocean Network. If ocean is your passion, get in touch, join that interest group, but there are many others as well. So do get in touch with the team and find out where your particular passion can fit in.
That's excellent. I'm convinced that one of the many things that can go right is people just stepping into their power, and knowing that responding to calls to action, initially a trickle, will become a flood and will make an absolute difference. So thank you very much for the work that you're doing. It's important.
Thank you very much. So, Chidi, we've got a little bit of bonus material here, because this little room where we put all our stuff, it has this sign on the wall here at the RSA. It says commitment to impact. Now, you said to me that is a really super important phrase. Tell me why.
Right. So the impact community exists. There are a group of people who think that we shouldn't be judging human effort, human business, human collective action on the grounds of profit, and then forgetting about the impact that we have on the environment. We should switch it completely the other way around. We start with impact, because everything we do has an impact on the people, places, time, planet around us. Profit is just one of those impacts. And so within the context of how things could go right, if we're having conversations with fellows or anyone else, we're trying to convince them that they can make a difference, we launch calls to action to call them in to join us, we need to ask them to think explicitly from the very beginning about what their commitment to impact is, because that's really what it's all about.
I love it. I love it. And one of the things they can commit to is talking about Ecocide Law.
100%. I think that people realize that, especially because of the work that you've done, which I've said many times is amazing, and I really do mean that and feel that, the work that you've done has moved the dial and the needle so much on what's achievable. People actually now realize that these calls to action, these requests from organizations, you join in and we mold our, collective voices in, so we're louder, much more powerful than we are as individuals. This is the kind of impact we need. Think of a world in which people understand that their place within nature and nature's places within ourselves are one and the same. Understanding that impact isn't something that happens accidentally. Impact is our raison d'etre. Don't think of that. That's definitely worth fighting for.
Definitely. And I think it's all about, I mean, collaboration is absolutely the name of the game, because that is how we create impact together. And it's about how fast that can happen. You know, when those connections are made, when those networks are sort of evolved, galvanized, that's when things can move really fast. And that's exactly how the Ecocide Law initiative has progressed. And it's interesting to see, I don't know if you've watched that show on Apple TV that's called Extrapolations, which kind of follows this sort of timeline as to what might happen if we do not take action on the climate and ecological crisis, or not enough, quick enough. And it follows through the different sort of decades going forwards. And interestingly, the last episode is set in 2070. And somebody is being taken to court, the richest man in the world is being taken to court for ecocide. And in that timeline that they're describing, you know, ecocide has been criminalized in 2050. Now, obviously, the way things are going, it's going to happen a lot sooner than that. We're actually anticipating it being more like, you know, it'll be in place by 2030, because it's kind of have to be. And actually, that series shows very well why it needs to be. But I have to say that I had a real sort of, you know, shiver down the spine moment, because in that episode, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, you know, gives the definition of ecocide, and it is the international definition that is in circulation now, that emerged from the panel that our foundation convened. And that was just an extraordinary moment. I'm thinking, wow, everybody that sees this is hearing this. And that was super exciting. And, you know, that's one of the things that can lead to this, you know, involvement, this impact, this people getting things and moving on things.
100%. I think there's a second order effect from after you take action, I take action, we take action. Someone else just steps into the fray and futurescapes. Just says to everyone, you know, by the way, if this thing gathers momentum, look what could go right. And at that point, we live with optimism, we focus on solutions, our energy becomes even more positive, we seek light, not just heat. No, it's called a virtuous circle, I think. Definitely worth aiming for.
I just heard something recently. It was a talk on YouTube. And this guy was saying, if you want a joyful revolution, you've got to be joyful about it.
100%. 100%. On that particular point, so 2 weeks ago, when you and I spoke in Parliament Square, I read out a poem by Václav Havel. And afterwards, this amazing young lady came up to me and said, who's Václav Havel? And I, obviously, being old, I thought everyone should know who Václav Havel is. But if you're in your early 20s, you do not know that the former Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia led this incredible revolution. Not only had Czechoslovakia leave the former Yugoslavia in the post-communist revolution, but also the country separated into two countries, the Czech and Slovakia. All of this without major wars or tumult. The ultimate historic, you know, velvet revolution. Something to think about for our future, maybe.
You've been listening to the Ecocide Report. You can find out more about all of the issues discussed in this episode via the links in the podcast description. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time.